Imagine being a child, locked in a room, starving, while the man you call father tells you this is what God demands. That sounds like the stuff of horror movies, but it was real. And it didn't happen in some hidden compound. It happened in suburbs, motels, and rental houses, with a Bible-waving missionary convincing families this torture was holy. He didn't need thousands of followers. He needed 24 people, including his own children, trapped in a traveling prison of abuse that lasted decades. The real toxin wasn't physical. It was theological. Scripture became the weapon. Faith became the cage. This is the story of Ron Larrinaga, a sadistic sociopath who used religion to manufacture helplessness, and how one woman finally broke free. Ron Larrinaga met Mary Rich and her family at their church in San Luis Obispo, California. He presented himself as a chosen servant of Jesus Christ, a self-styled missionary with a direct line to God's will. He was charismatic. He quoted scripture fluently. He spoke with absolute certainty about divine purpose and spiritual devotion. Mary Rich was a born-again Christian, deeply committed to her faith. Her husband shared her beliefs, but lacked her intensity. When Larrinaga began attending their church, he recognized that intensity. He saw vulnerability disguised as devotion. He didn't recruit with threats. He recruited with promises, spiritual community, a family united in faith, a chance to serve God at a higher level than ordinary churchgoers ever could. For Mary Rich and her 6 children, it felt like an answer to prayer. Larrinaga's own family, his wife, and 11 children were already part of his ministry. When he invited the Rich family to join them, it didn't seem dangerous. It seemed like belonging. The group moved to a remote house in Northern California. Larrinaga framed it as a religious retreat, a place where they could focus on God without the distractions of the secular world. Isolation presented as devotion. Control presented as spiritual guidance. At first, the warning signs were subtle. Larrinaga made decisions for everyone: where they lived, what they ate, how they spent their time. But he justified every directive with scripture. He positioned himself not as a dictator, but as an interpreter of God's commands. Questioning him meant questioning God. Mary Rich wanted to be faithful. Her husband wanted to support his family's spiritual journey. The children trusted the adults, and Larrinaga exploited that trust with surgical precision. The psychological hook was simple. He convinced them their existing faith wasn't enough. They needed to prove their devotion. They needed to pass tests, and only he could determine what those tests required. The retreat became a prison the moment the door closed behind them, but nobody realized it yet, because the bars were invisible. They were made of scripture, shame, and the belief that suffering was proof of righteousness. Larrinaga didn't just isolate them physically, he isolated them theologically. He taught them that the outside world, including their own relatives, couldn't understand their higher calling. That persecution was evidence they were chosen. That doubt was the devil's weapon. He created a closed system where his word was law, his interpretation was truth, and his authority was absolute. The Bible became a tool of control. Faith became a mechanism of torture, and the abuse was just beginning. Larrinaga didn't call it abuse. He called it purification. The beatings started as corrections. Minor infractions, such as a child speaking out of turn, a question about his authority, or a moment of hesitation, became opportunities for discipline. But the discipline escalated. What began as slaps became prolonged beatings with belts, fists, and whatever objects were available. He told them this was biblical. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Suffering built character. Pain brought them closer to God. The children, both his own and Mary Rich's, learned to accept the beatings as normal. They were told they deserved it, that they weren't good enough, that if they could just be more obedient, more faithful, more perfect, the beatings would stop. They never stopped. Starvation became another test. Larrinaga would deny food to children for days, calling it a spiritual fast. He claimed God was testing their faith, that hunger purified the soul. Children too young to understand theology were told. Their empty stomachs proved their devotion. Mary Rich and her husband watched their children suffer. They suffered themselves, but Larrinaga had convinced them this was necessary, that questioning him meant failing God. He used scripture to reframe every act of cruelty as divine requirement. Then came the sexual abuse. Larrinaga molested his own children. He molested Mary Rich's children. He presented these acts not as crimes, but as religious duties. Twisted interpretations of submission and obedience that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with power. The abuse was systematic, calculated. He didn't lose control, he exercised it. Every act of violence, every moment of humiliation, every instance of sexual assault was framed as a test of obedience. And the victims were told they were failing. This is how theological manipulation works. It takes something sacred, faith, devotion, the desire to please God, and weaponizes it. Larrinaga didn't just hurt bodies, he dismantled moral compasses. He convinced his victims that their own suffering was evidence of their unworthiness. Mary Rich later described being told she deserved the years of humiliation, that if she had been a better Christian, a more faithful servant, God wouldn't have required these tests. Larrinaga used the Bible to manufacture shame, and shame is a prison without walls. The children internalized the same message. They believed they were bad, that the abuse was their fault, that if they could just be good enough, it would end. But good enough was impossible. Larrinaga kept moving the target. No amount of obedience satisfied him, because satisfaction wasn't the point. Control was the point. The tests weren't designed to be passed. They were designed to break resistance. This created learned helplessness, a psychological state where victims stop trying to escape because they believe escape is impossible. The abuse became their reality. Larrinaga became the arbiter of that reality, and his word, backed by distorted scripture, became unquestionable law. Mary Rich and her husband were trapped in the same cycle. They watched their children suffer and blamed themselves. Larrinaga convinced them that good parents would accept God's will, even when that will meant watching their children starve and bleed. The psychological prison was complete. Physical isolation would ensure no one could challenge it. But the real bars were already in place, constructed from faith, fear, and the manufactured belief that suffering was salvation. The group didn't stay in Northern California. They couldn't, because Larrinaga refused to send the children to school, a legal requirement in every state. And authorities were starting to ask questions. So they ran. The core group, including Mary Rich's family and Larrinaga's own wife and children, began traveling across the United States. They moved from California to Arizona, from Arizona to Texas, from Texas to Florida. They lived in motels, rental houses, and temporary lodgings. They never stayed anywhere long enough for neighbors to notice, never long enough for teachers to report missing children, never long enough for anyone to intervene. Larrinaga framed this nomadic existence as religious persecution. He told his followers they were being hunted because the secular world couldn't understand their devotion. That law enforcement represented Satan's attempt to destroy their holy mission. That staying ahead of authorities proved their faith. But the real function of constant movement had nothing to do with faith. It was about control. Every time the group relocated, they left behind any potential support systems. No friendships could form. No concerned neighbors could call protective services. No relatives could track them down. The children had no teachers, no doctors, no contact with anyone outside the group. Mary Rich was forced to cut off all communication with her own family and friends. This isolation wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Larrinaga understood that external relationships represented threats to his authority. A friend might notice bruises. A relative might ask uncomfortable questions. A teacher might recognize signs of abuse, so he eliminated those threats. He made the group dependent on constant movement, and that movement made them dependent on him. They had no resources, no money of their own, no knowledge of where they were or how to get help. The outside world became abstract, something they saw through motel windows but never accessed. Financial dependence reinforced the trap. Members had no income, no bank accounts, no means of survival outside the group. Leaving meant abandoning the only life they knew, with no money, no plan, and, thanks to Larrinaga's theological manipulation, the belief that leaving meant damning their souls. The persecution complex became self-reinforcing. Life on the run felt dangerous, which proved Larrinaga's claims about external threats, which justified the isolation, which prevented anyone from discovering the abuse. The group eventually settled in Florida, where Larrinaga continued his reign of terror in yet another anonymous rental house. The children, now teenagers, had spent years moving, isolated from education, from peers, from any reality beyond Larrinaga's twisted theology. Mary Rich later described this period as complete psychological captivity. The cult became the only recognized reality. Larrinaga's word became the only truth, and escape seemed impossible because there was nowhere to escape to. He had severed every lifeline. The control seemed absolute. The abuse continued undetected. The victims remained trapped in a traveling prison, with bars made of scripture and fear. Then Larrinaga made one critical mistake. He abandoned the very person whose faith he had weaponized for decades, and that abandonment broke the spell. For decades, Ron Larrinaga positioned himself as the indispensable interpreter of God's will. He was the prophet, the chosen servant, the only person capable of guiding his followers towards salvation. His authority was absolute because he claimed it came from a higher power. Then he walked away. Larrinaga abandoned Mary Rich. He simply left the woman he had tortured for years in the name of divine testing, the mother whose children he had starved and beaten and molested while claiming it was God's command. The abandonment revealed something Mary Rich hadn't been able to see through years of abuse. Larrinaga's theology was a lie. If he truly believed his own teachings, that suffering was purification, that his leadership was divinely ordained, that the group's mission required absolute devotion, he wouldn't have abandoned it. His departure proved he was motivated by self-interest, not faith. He wasn't a prophet. He was a predator. Predators move on when their current hunting ground becomes inconvenient. Mary Rich described what happened next as coming to her senses. That phrase captures the fog of mind control. The way psychological manipulation creates an altered state where abuse feels normal, where questioning feels sinful, where escape feels impossible. Abandonment shattered that fog. Without Larrinaga's physical presence reinforcing the theological framework, the framework collapsed. Mary Rich could finally see the years of torture for what they were. Not tests of faith, but crimes against children. Not divine will, but sadistic control. She made the decision to file criminal charges. That decision required extraordinary courage. She had spent years believing she deserved the abuse. Years internalizing shame. Years convinced that speaking against Larrinaga meant speaking against God. But she filed charges anyway. In Florida, where the group had finally stopped running, prosecutors built a case based on testimony from survivors, medical evidence of abuse, and the documented pattern of torture spanning decades. The evidence was overwhelming. 42 counts of molestation and child abuse, testimony from Mary Rich, from her children, from witnesses who had seen the bruises and heard the screams, physical scars that corroborated years of beatings, psychological damage that spoke to prolonged trauma. Ron Larrinaga was found guilty on all counts, every single charge. The jury saw through his claims of religious persecution. They recognized the difference between faith and manipulation. They understood that scripture, used to justify harming children, isn't theology. It's weaponized control. The judge sentenced him to 180 years in prison. That sentence acknowledged the scale of his crimes. Decades of systematic abuse against 24 people, including his own children. A traveling prison of torture, hidden behind the facade of missionary work. Larrinaga would die behind bars. His victims would carry the scars forever. But the legal verdict represented something crucial: accountability, the recognition that no amount of religious language excuses violence, that faith cannot be weaponized to justify cruelty, that leaders who claim divine authority are still subject to human law. The conviction couldn't undo the damage. It couldn't give Mary Rich's children back their childhoods. It couldn't erase the years of starvation, beatings, and sexual abuse. But it ended Larrinaga's ability to hurt anyone else. And it validated what the survivors had endured. Proof that they weren't crazy, weren't sinful, weren't deserving of torture. They were victims. And their abuser was finally held accountable. The legal victory couldn't erase the psychological damage. Mary Rich spent years in therapy after Larrinaga's conviction. The work of untangling decades of theological manipulation, manufactured shame, and learned helplessness doesn't happen quickly. She had to rebuild her sense of self from rubble. In 1996, she published a memoir, Evil Web, a true story of cult abuse and courage. The book broke her silence. It exposed the mechanisms Larrinaga used to trap intelligent, faithful people in a cycle of torture. It documented the specific ways scripture can be weaponized, and it served as a warning to others. Writing the book was part of her recovery. But it was also an act of defiance. Larrinaga had spent decades controlling the narrative by telling his victims what they deserved, what God required, and what reality meant. The memoir took that narrative back. It told the truth in Mary Rich's own words. In 2013, the case was featured in the documentary series Dangerous Persuasions, in an episode titled Diabolical Discipline. The public reckoning continued. The story reached people who had never heard of Ron Larrinaga, but recognized the patterns, the isolation, the theological justification of abuse, the manufactured helplessness. The children faced their own struggle. They grew up in an environment where abuse was mandated as love, where starvation was called purification, where sexual assault was framed as obedience to God. That kind of distortion doesn't disappear when the abuser goes to prison. Many survivors of childhood cult abuse carry trauma bonding, psychological attachments to their abusers that persist despite the harm. They struggle with learned helplessness, the belief that their actions don't matter because nothing they do will change their circumstances. They have distorted senses of normalcy, where cruelty feels familiar and safety feels foreign. Recovery requires rebuilding everything. Basic concepts like trust, boundaries, and self-worth have to be learned from scratch. The children who survived Larrinaga's cult had to figure out what healthy relationships looked like, what normal parenting involved, what faith could mean without manipulation. This is why intelligent, faithful people fall into these traps. Larrinaga didn't target stupid people. He targeted people with genuine spiritual seeking, people who wanted to serve God, who valued community, who believed in something larger than themselves. He exploited those good impulses and turned them into weapons. The scale of the group, 24 people, made the abuse easier to hide. Large cults attract media attention. Small groups operate under the radar. Larrinaga's traveling prison moved through suburbs and rental houses without anyone noticing. The children had no teachers to report bruises. The adults had no co-workers to ask questions. Domestic cult dynamics differ from large-scale movements in critical ways. They're harder to detect because they look like families. They're easier to dismiss because they don't fit stereotypes of robed followers in compounds. And they're just as dangerous, sometimes more so, because the isolation is complete. Mary Rich's courage in filing charges, in writing her memoir, in speaking publicly about what happened, created a roadmap for other survivors. She proved that breaking free was possible, that the shame belonged to the abuser, not the victim, that speaking the truth mattered. But recovery is ongoing. As of the memoir's publication, Mary Rich was still in therapy, still rebuilding, still processing decades of trauma. The legal victory was essential. The public exposure was important. But healing takes time, and some scars never fully fade. There are patterns that mark domestic cult dynamics. They hide in families, churches, and small groups, places where abuse gets mistaken for devotion. Watch for theological justification of harm. If scripture is being used to justify violence, starvation, or control, that's not faith. That's weaponized religion. Real spiritual guidance doesn't require bruises. Watch for enforced isolation. When a leader demands that members cut off contact with relatives, friends, or outside communities, that's not spiritual devotion. That's eliminating witnesses. Isolation makes abuse invisible. Watch for manufactured shame. Victims get told they deserve the abuse, that their suffering proves their unworthiness. This psychological weapon keeps people trapped, even when physical escape is possible. The shame doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the abuser. Watch for absolute authority without accountability. A leader who claims divine mandate but answers to no one, no board, no oversight, no questioning, isn't running a ministry. That's a dictatorship with a Bible. And watch for constant relocation, moving frequently to evade authorities, avoid detection, or prevent children from attending school isn't missionary work. It's a systematic strategy to eliminate external intervention. Ron Larrinaga operated for decades because no one outside the group knew what was happening. The children had no teachers to report bruises. The adults had no co-workers to ask questions. Neighbors never stayed in the picture long enough to notice. If you recognize these patterns in your own community, speak up. Call local child protective services. Contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Reach out to the International Cultic Studies Association for guidance on intervention. Awareness is your first line of defense. But action is what stops the abuse. Drop a comment. What stood out to you about this case? Subscribe, because recognizing these patterns could save someone's life.